Imagine standing alone in a fossil hall after closing time. The lights are dim, the room is silent. Towering of you is a massive skeleton, a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Its jaws frozen open, its ribs arching overhead like the beams of an ancient cathedral. And here's the strange thing. You're not actually looking at a dinosaur. You're looking at an argument, a reconstruction, a story assembled from fragments, scattered bones buried beneath layers of rocks for 66 million years. A paleontologist does not discover a complete dinosaur waiting perfectly assembled underground often. They uncover pieces, fragments, partial remains, and then, using logic, inference, comparison, and interpretation, they reconstruct a coherent picture of the past. That process is profoundly human, and strangely, it mirrors the crisis of modern civilization itself. Because today, we are drowning in fragments. Studies, statistics, headlines, data, algorithms, expert panels, and information. More information than any civilization in human history. But modern people increasingly mistake access to information for understanding. Memorizing facts is not the same thing as wisdom. A civilization can accumulate enormous amounts of data while still losing the ability to reason clearly about what the data means. And yet, public discourse feels intellectually catastrophic. People no longer know how to argue. Not really. We cite experts instead of building reason. We confuse confidence with truth. We weaponize science against philosophy. We weaponize religion against science. And somewhere along the way, civilization forgot something crucial. Facts alone do not interpret themselves. Data is not wisdom. And science by itself cannot answer every question human beings ask. Today, I want to explore a controversial idea that the separation of science from philosophy and theology did not make civilization more rational. It made us fragmented. Because once science abandoned philosophy, it slowly lost touch with the discipline that teaches human beings how to reason clearly. And once civilization abandoned theology, it increasingly lost any shared framework for meaning, morality, humility, and existential purpose. The result? A culture with extraordinary technological power and diminishing intellectual coherence. And nowhere is that fracture more fascinating than in paleontology. I'm your host, Eric Crawford, and this is the Prehistoric Life Podcast. Let's dig in. For most of human history, science did not exist as its own isolated discipline. What we now call science was once known as natural philosophy. That title matters because it implied the study of nature was inseparable from deeper questions about truth, logic, existence, and meaning. Before students studied astronomy or medicine or physics or geology, they studied the trivium: grammar, logic, rhetoric. These things are important. They each are very foundational. Grammar taught precision of language. Rhetoric taught persuasive communication. And logic taught how to think without contradiction or fallacy. These disciplines were considered foundational because people understood something modern cultures increasingly forgets. A human being can process enormous amounts of information while still reasoning badly. And if you remove logic from intellectual life, raw information quickly becomes chaos. Science was originally built on philosophical foundations. Even the scientific method itself depends on the assumptions that science alone cannot empirically prove. For example, of these things, science assumes reality is intelligible. It assumes cause and effect are constant. It assumes logic corresponds to truth. It assumes our senses are generally reliable enough to observe reality accurately. And even observation itself is never entirely neutral, though. Human beings interpret evidence through conceptual frameworks, expectations, assumptions, and prior models. Philosophers and historians of science sometimes call this theory ladenness. Data does not automatically interpret itself. Sometimes multiple explanations can fit the same body of evidence. Data alone does not always uniquely determine a single conclusion. Scientists still rely on philosophical judgment about simplicity, coherence, explanatory power, and the probability when deciding between competing models. A good example is like think about the Spinosaurus recently that we've talked about, how they determine and they're arguing whether it's saltwater, if it was mainly saltwater or not. But I digress. But here's the important part. None of these assumptions can themselves be scientifically proven without circular reasoning. Science depends on philosophy before science can even begin. Questions about induction, causation, falsibility, inference, and the reliability of reason are not scientific questions themselves. They are philosophical foundations underneath science, which means philosophy of science is not optional decoration. It is part of the intellectual scaffolding supporting science itself. And this is not a weakness of science. It is simply the reality that all systems of thought rest on foundational assumptions. But over time, especially after the Enlightenment and into the 19th and 20th century, the relationship between science and philosophy began to fracture. Science specialization accelerated. And to be fair, specialization produced extraordinary achievements. Things like modern medicine, engineering with these massive bridges, vaccines to help people when they're sick, computers, which is what I'm delivering this message on, genetics so that we can understand our bodies to help us better with this medicine. We have done space exploration. The technological success of modern science is undeniable, but specialization also came with a cost. The more fragmented disciplines became, the more scientific education increasingly emphasized technical competence while neglecting philosophical formation. Scientists became highly trained in gathering data, but often receive little training in epistemology or the study of how knowledge itself works. And slowly, public culture began confusing information with wisdom. Part of the confusion emerged because modern cultures increasingly blurred the distinction between methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism. Methodological naturalism simply means science studies natural cause because causes are observable and testable. That is how science functions operationally. But philosophical naturalism is a much larger metaphysical claim. It's that the natural world is all that ultimately exists. That consciousness, morality, meaning, and purpose are ultimately reducible to blind physical processes. Science requires the first, but it does not automatically prove the second. Yet modern culture increasingly treats them as interchangeable. And once that happened, science slowly transformed in the public imagination from a method of investigation into a total worldview. Most people today inherit a very simplistic understanding of the relationship between science and religion. The story usually goes like this: religion represents ignorance, and science represents enlightenment. And history is basically the story of science heroically defeating superstition. It's a clear narrative. It's a very clear narrative, but historically, it is deeply misleading. Many of the founders of modern science were religious men who believed the universe was rational precisely because it reflected divine order. Isaac Newton extensively wrote about theology. Johannes Kepler believed studying nature was a way of understanding cosmic harmony. Robert Boyle viewed scientific inquiry as an act of reverence. Scientists often pursue elegant theories because human beings instinctively associate beauty and symmetry and simplicity and coherence with truth. Physicists regularly describe equations as beautiful long before experimental confirmation arrives. And beauty itself is not a scientific measurement. It is a philosophical and aesthetic intuition guiding scientific thought. Even the idea that nature operates according to discoverable laws emerged partly because theological assumptions about order in intelligibility. Medieval monasteries preserved enormous numbers of classical texts through periods of political instability. Many of Europe's earliest universities emerged within Christian civilization itself, which complicates the simplistic narrative that religion merely suppresses knowledge. Now, this does not mean historical relationship between science and religion has always been peaceful. There was absolutely conflict. Religious institutions sometimes overstepped into empirical matters. Political authorities sometimes suppressed inquiry. Scientists often sought methodological independence for legitimate reasons. But differentiation is not the same thing as total warfare. The real tragedy became when the disciplines stopped speaking to one another entirely. Because once science became increasingly isolated from philosophy and theology, a vacuum emerged. Science became extraordinarily good at explaining mechanisms, while society increasingly lost confidence in answering questions of meaning. And human beings cannot survive on mechanism alone. People want purpose, morality, transcendentness, meaning. Empirical science is extraordinarily powerful at measuring observational phenomena, but not every meaningful aspect of human existence is fully quantifiable. Beauty, consciousness, love, meaning, moral obligation. Science can study the dimensions of these experiences, but describing mechanisms is not always the same thing as exhausting significance. Science can explain how the stars form, but science cannot explain or tell you why beauty moves the human soul. Science can describe the neurological activity during love, but science cannot explain why love feels meaningful. Science can measure human behavior, but science alone cannot derive moral obligation from raw chemistry. Science can describe what human beings do. It cannot independently determine what human beings ought to do morally. A chemistry textbook can explain the molecular structure of a poison. It cannot tell you whether poisoning someone is evil. Ethics requires philosophy. Science may explain evolutionary origins of certain behaviors or emotions, but scientific descriptions alone cannot tell someone why their life matters. Human meaning cannot simply be extracted from chemistry. Those are philosophical and theological questions. And pretending otherwise simply confuses categories. Science alone depends on ethic virtues it cannot scientifically manufacture. Honestly, integrity, openness to correction, and commitment to truth, even when truth is inconvenient. Without those moral assumptions, scientific institutions themselves begin to decay. So, how did we get here then? If science once emerged from philosophy, if early scientists saw no contradiction between scientific inquiry and deeper questions of meaning, then what happened? The answer is not science defeated philosophy. It's not that religion disappeared. The answer is something more subtle. The disciplines stopped speaking to one another. It's that simple. What began as a family of interconnected ways of understanding reality gradually became separated intellectual kingdoms. And over time, those kingdoms built walls. They built walls. As human knowledge expanded, specialization became necessary. No single person could master astronomy and medicine and chemistry, mathematics, history, theology, philosophy, and the law all at once. Knowledge was growing too rapidly. Specialization allowed humanity to make extraordinary progress. Scientists focused on narrower questions. Researchers developed deeper expertise. Universities created departments dedicated to specific fields. And the results were astonishing. Like I mentioned earlier, modern medicine, along with electronics, genetics, aviation, computer, space exploration, specialization worked. But every gain came with a trade-off. As expertise increased, integration decreased. Scholars became increasingly knowledgeable about smaller and smaller pieces of reality, yet fewer people were trained to ask how those pieces fit together. Universities that once viewed knowledge as a unified pursuit gradually fragmented into isolated disciplines. The physicists studied matter, the biologists studied life, the economists studied the market, the philosophers studied abstract ideas, the theologians studied ultimate meaning. Each discipline developed its own language, its own assumptions, its own methods, its own professional culture. And eventually, many stopped communicating with one another altogether. The result was a strange paradox. Humanity became more educated than ever before, yet increasingly uncertain about how different forms of knowledge related to one another. A scientist could spend years mastering highly technical material without ever taking a serious course in logic, ethics, or epistemology. A philosopher could discuss meaning and morality while at the same time remaining disconnected from modern scientific discoveries. A theologian could wrestle with questions of purpose while having little engagement with contemporary research. The walls grew higher, and the conversation grew weaker. Philosophy, once considered the foundation of intellectual life, increasingly became viewed as optional. Useful perhaps, interesting perhaps, but not essential. Many educational systems shifted their focus towards technical competence, professional specialization, and measurable outcomes. Students learned how to perform calculations, how to conduct experiments, how to analyze data, but often received far less training in how to evaluate assumptions, recognize fallacies, or think critically about the limits of their knowledge. Meanwhile, theology was increasingly pushed to the margins of public intellectual life altogether. Questions of meaning, purpose, morality, and transcendence were often treated as purely private concerns, not because those questions disappeared, but because modern institutions increasingly lacked a common language of discussing them. And yet, human beings never stopped asking them. Why are we here? What is consciousness? What makes something morally right or wrong? What gives life meaning? Why does beauty move us? Why does truth matter? Scientific specialization could answer many questions, but not all questions. But the more civilization focused extensively on mechanism, the more those deeper questions accumulated unanswered. This was the grand divorce. Not science defeating philosophy, not religion defeating science, but the gradual separation of the disciplines that once worked together. Science became increasingly powerful at explaining how the world works. Philosophy became increasingly detached from public life. Theology increasingly disconnected from mainstream intellectual culture. Each retained part of the picture, but fewer people were looking at the whole. And perhaps that is why modern civilization often feels fragmented, because we possess extraordinary knowledge, yet struggle to integrate it into a coherent understanding of reality. We know more facts than any civilization in history, yet many people feel less certain about the meaning, purpose, truth, and wisdom than ever before. The divorce was not merely institutional, it was intellectual, it was cultural. And in many ways, we are still living with the consequences of it today. Listen carefully to public discourse. Almost nobody argues logically anymore. People cite studies they haven't read, repeat slogans, appeal to consensus, attack motives, weaponize credentials, and then call it intellectual debate. Now, let me be clear. Expertise matters. Scientific institutions matter. Consensus can absolutely be useful, but consensus is not identical to logical proof. And the distinction matters enormously. History is full of scientific consensuses that later turned out to be incomplete or incorrect. Science progresses precisely because arguments remain open to challenge. Many influential studies failed replication attempts despite widespread acceptance, not because science is fraudulent, but because scientists are human beings operating inside systems of incentives, prestige, funding pressures, publication demands, and career advancements. Research priorities are often influenced by grants, institutional politics, media visibility, and professional incentives, which means scientific culture requires ethical self-correction just like every other human institution. But modern culture increasingly treats disagreement itself as moral deviance. Because without philosophical training, people become vulnerable to basic logical fallacies. Take the idea of scientism, for example. Scientism is not science. Scientism is the philosophical claim that science is the only path to objective truth. At a first glance, that sounds scientific, but it isn't. Because the statement itself cannot be scientifically tested. You cannot place the claim, science is the only source of truth, into a laboratory experiment, meaning the statement defeats itself. It is a philosophical assertion pretending not to be philosophical. And that is one of the greatest ironies of modern culture. Even people attempting to reject philosophy are still doing philosophy, usually unconsciously. And unconscious philosophy is often the most dangerous kind because people stop examining their own assumptions. Another common fallacy dominating modern discourse is the appeal to authority. Again, expertise matters. I want to drive that home. But saying experts agree, therefore stop questioning, is not an argument. It is social pressure. Real argument requires explaining why a conclusion follows from evidence. Healthy skepticism asks careful questions while remaining open to evidence. Cynicism assumes corruption everywhere and abandons trust entirely. Modern discourse increasingly swings between blind faith in authority and total distrust of institution because philosophical literacy has weakened. And once society stopped teaching formal logic, emotional rhetoric naturally fills that vacuum. You can see this everywhere now. People increasingly judge arguments not by coherence, but by whether they emotionally affirm their tribal identity. And once that happens, truth itself becomes secondary to group loyalty. Once scientific positions become markers for tribal identity, disagreements stop feeling intellectual and start feeling emotional. Debate becomes less about discovering truth and more about defending belonging. There's another consequence to this separation that people rarely talk about. And honestly, it may be the saddest consequence of all. When science becomes completely separated from philosophy and theology, science slowly begins to lose its sense of wonder. Not immediately. The discoveries are still incredible. The data is still fascinating. The technology is still advancing, and it is still advanced. But over time, something deeper starts fading away. Because human beings do not experience reality merely as machines processing information, we experience reality emotionally, spiritually. And once reality is framed as nothing more than blind matter in motion, nothing more than accidental particles colliding in a purposeless universe, the emotional texture of discovery begins to just flatten. The stars stop feeling transcendent. Life stops feeling miraculous. Consciousness becomes a chemical side effect. Beauty becomes evolutionary conditioning. Love becomes neurological activity. And eventually, science itself risks becoming spiritually weightless. Not because the discoveries become less effective, but because civilization loses the philosophical language necessary to experience those discoveries as meaningful. Think about the experience of a child seeing a dinosaur skeleton for the first time. They stand there completely speechless. Not because they understand cladistics, not because they've analyzed phylogenetic database, but because they're overwhelmed by awe, the feeling of awe. They're confronting something ancient, massive, mysterious, something larger than themselves. That feeling matters. Wonder matters. In fact, wonder may be one of the most important human experiences there is, because wonder is often the beginning of inquiry itself. The ancient philosophers understood this. Aristotle once wrote that philosophy begins in wonder. And honestly, science begins there too. The scientist staring into a telescope, the paleontologist uncovering fossils in the Hell Creek or Morrison Formation, the physicist studying the early universe, the biologist observing the complexity of life. That is the deepest level. All of them are responding to the same thing, the overwhelming strangeness and beauty of existence itself. But modern culture increasingly treats wonder as intellectual suspicions Everything must immediately be reduced, explained away, flattened into pure mechanism. And to be clear, mechanisms matter, scientific explanation matters, understanding physical processes matters enormously, but explanation and meaning are not the same thing. Reducing a cathedral to chemistry does not explain its beauty. Reducing music to vibrations does not explain why it moves the soul. Reducing human consciousness to neurons firing does not eliminate the lived reality of love, grief, hope, fear, transcendence. And reducing the history of life to mere material processes does not erase the staggering awe-inspiring by existence itself. In some ways, modern civilizations became so obsessed with explaining things that they forgot how to behold them. Historically, many of the greatest scientific minds did not see discovery as diminishing wonder. They saw it as deepening wonder. The more they learned about the universe, the more mysterious and beautiful reality appeared. Because science was not originally viewed as the destruction of mystery, it was viewed as the exploration of mystery. And that distinction matters enormously. A universe stripped entirely of transcendence eventually becomes emotionally hollow. And when science becomes emotionally hollow, people stop loving it. It becomes sterile, cold, institutional, a collection of facts disconnected from human meaning. And honestly, I think this is part of why public trust in science has fractured so badly. Because many people do not merely want information. They want meaning. They want beauty. They want some sense that existence itself matters. And when scientific communication speaks only in the language of mechanism while refusing to engage deeper human questions, people begin searching elsewhere. But perhaps the answer is not abandoning science. Perhaps the answer is recovering a fuller version of reality, one where science, philosophy, and theology are not enemies competing for territory, but companions helping human beings encounter truth from different angles. Because science without wonder eventually becomes utilitarian. Philosophy without reality becomes abstraction. And theology without humility becomes ideology. But together, they can produce something far richer, a civilization capable not only of understanding the world, but standing in awe of it. This entire conflict becomes especially fascinating in paleontology, because paleontology naturally pushes human beings towards existential reflection. Dinosaurs are not merely scientific specimens. They are encounters with deep time, with extinction, with fragility, with the staggering scale of existence itself. Picture a field crew excavating fossils beneath Montana's sun. Picture hands carefully brushing away sediment from vertebra untouched since the late Cretaceous. In moments like that, paleontologists stop feeling like it's sterile data collection. It becomes confrontation with reality at its utmost spiritual scale. And this is important. Wonder is not irrational. Wonder is often the beginning of both science and philosophy. Historically, curiosity and reverence were not opposites. Wonder drove inquiry long before modern culture tried separating science and transcendence. A child standing beneath a sauropod skeleton is not experiencing a spreadsheet. They are experiencing awe. And awe is historically driven human beings towards deeper inquiry about existence itself. But modern culture often strips this dimension away. Fossils become ideological ammunition. Science communication becomes hostile, and public discourse collapses into caricatures. The secular materialist says the evidence is obvious. Only ignorant people disagree. Meanwhile, the reactionary fundamentalist says, you weren't there a million years ago, so you can't know anything. Both responses miss the point entirely. Historical science operates through inference, through reconstruction, through reasoning towards the best explanation, which means paleontology is already deeply philosophical, whether people admit it or not. And perhaps that is one reason dinosaurs fascinate us so deeply. They remind us that human beings are not merely collecting information. We are trying to understand our place inside a reality far older and stranger than ourselves. A dinosaur skeleton can be chemically analyzed down to the minerals and molecular traces. But reducing something to chemistry does not exhaust its meaning. Human beings naturally experience higher levels of significance, awe, beauty, narrative, essential reflection, and wonder. Reduction is not always the same thing as explanation. And perhaps one of the saddest consequences of this fragmentation is that many young people feel forced into an artificial choice, intellectual curiosity or spiritual meaning, as though loving science requires abandoning transcendence, or seeking transcendence requires fearing science. That false dichotomy impoverishes both. So, how do we begin rebuilding that bridge? So where do we go from here? Well, first, we need philosophy back in scientific education, not as a decoration, not as an elective, as a foundation. Scientists should understand logic, epistemology, ethics, philosophy of science, the limits of empirical reasoning, because science without philosophy risks becoming technically powerful but intellectually shallow. Second, we need intellectual humility. Science is an incredible tool, one of humanity's greatest achievements, but tools have domains. A microscope cannot discover morality. A telescope cannot explain purpose. A particle accelerator cannot answer why human dignity matters. Those are philosophical and theological questions, and acknowledging that does not weaken science. It protects science from becoming ideological. Many of history's greatest scientists were profoundly aware of how little humanity actually knows. Real scientific maturity does not produce arrogance. It produces humility before reality itself. Modern civilization advanced technologically faster than it advanced morally or philosophically. Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, surveillance system, autonomous weapons. Humanity increasingly possesses the power to reshape civilization itself, while remaining deeply uncertain about what wisdom should guide that power. Third, we need to recover wonder, not shallow entertainment, real wonder, the kind that humbles people, the kind that reminds us reality is larger than our political tribes. Because at its best, science should not flatten mystery. It should deepen it. And finally, we need to stop treating science and religion as inevitable enemies. They ask different kinds of questions. Science investigates mechanism. Philosophy investigates reasoning. Theology investigates meaning and ultimate purpose. These disciplines are not supposed to destroy one another. They are supposed to refine one another. A fossil is not valuable merely because it is ancient. It is valuable because it tells a story. Fragments become meaningful when assembled into coherence. And perhaps that is the real crisis of modern civilization. Not a lack of information, but a lack of integration. Civilization does not suffer from too much science. It suffers from science severed from philosophy, ethics, humility, and meaning. We have accumulated mountains of facts while losing confidence in wisdom. Science gives humanity extraordinary powerful. Philosophy teaches us how to reason about that power. And theology asks what that power is ultimately for. The scientist, the philosopher, and the theologian are not meant to be enemies. They are looking at the same reality through different windows. And perhaps civilization became confused the moment we insisted only one of those windows mattered. The next time you stand beneath a dinosaur skeleton, you are not merely looking at bones. You are looking at humanity's attempt to reconstruct truth from fragments. And maybe that is exactly what we must learn to do. Until next time, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I'm your host, Eric Crawford. This has been the Prehistoric Life Podcast. And remember, keep it prehistoric. Goodbye.